we get started? So my name is Imran Velodia, and it's my job to get us out of the starting blocks here. So we kind of meeting today with the background of an important kind of process in the legal system around how South Africa is going to deal with the kind of issue of climate change. And we kind of really pleased to have one of the senior officials in the kind of department that's in charge of this process, the DFFE, to kind of share with us the kind of plans around the law. And it's a fantastic opportunity for us to give the department some feedback and to kind of engage with the process. So a kind of special welcome to our speaker, Jongikhaya Witi, who is the Chief Director of Climate Change Mitigation and Specialist Monitoring Services at the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. Jongikhaya has a kind of hugely impressive set of academic kind of qualifications, including an MSc in kind of energy and climate change from the University of Cape Town, and he has worked in the public sector pretty extensively on issues kind of related to climate change. So the seminar today is co-hosted with Kels. Before I pass on to Jongikhaya, I'm just going to ask Robert Krause from Kels to just say a few words, and then we can pass on to our speaker.
Thank you, Professor Velodia. So, good morning, colleagues. So, I think we had as a very important juncture where we were making decisions about how to deal with and mitigate but also adapt to the consequences of runaway climate change and limited to 1.5C. And it really is a process that requires a lot of collaboration because for many reasons. So it's also there's a lot of scientific and technical components of it, which really require academia and government at the same table. Equally, there are so many fundamental social and climate justice issues regarding the particular topic of carbon budgeting. So, who is allowed to emit how much, for what kinds of activities, for whose benefits, what are the economic and social priorities? And so this is really an important discussion. And also, as some of us know, we are a bit of a hybrid of a university center, but also part of civil society who straddle those roles, and also the public interest law sector. And so we're very interested in coming together and engaging both with academia and also bringing the conversation closer to communities as well. And one of our methodology, or not one of our pillars of our work at Cal, we've got four, but one of our pillars of achieving our social justice aims is partnerships with the state, actually, to kind of inject that social justice perspective with a bit of mutual learning to ensure the policies and implementation of the policies achieve climate justice in this context before the social justice. Thank you, everyone.
Right, so over to you, Jongikhaya.
No, thank you, Prof. Special thanks to Julia for organizing and inviting us to say something about what we're doing about climate change from a legal perspective. So I just, it's sort of an easy one, just to give you an indication of what it is that we're doing in terms of climate response. The emphasis here is on climate change mitigation, so not on adaptation. But if you do have any questions of clarity, I can attempt to answer those. If not, I will record those questions for my colleagues to have answered. So that's the one thing. The second thing is just to give you an overview of our mitigation system. What are the elements of climate change mitigation? And also a sense of in each element what it is that we want, but also where are we with that, and maybe some of the key messages. So I have prepared a presentation. Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah, so feel free at any stage to interject. So my presentation starts with the graphic straight away. This is all the elements of the mitigation system. So if you wanted to know, what legal instruments are we going to use to manage process emission, this slide captures all these aspects. All of them, most of which are actually captured in the legislation. So on your top left, you have the mitigation goal. So what is important about that is understanding of if someone asks what is South Africa committing to in terms of emissions, that's what this is aiming to answer. In terms of that, currently we do not have an updated long-term mitigation goal. Normally our timeline is up to 2050. The latest one we have is what we used to call peak plateau and decline. That emissions trajectory goal is outdated. It's very high compared to where our emissions are at the moment. So if you were following the discussions in the portfolio committee, there was huge pressure for us not to make reference to that in the bill. And we have acceded to that. And what we've then said is the current goal is actually what we communicated in the NDC, which sets targets up to 2030, where our emissions must not exceed 420 million tons by 2030. So that's where we are with that, but I'll touch on it again later. And then bottom left is the monitoring of GHG emissions. So what are the tools are we using to monitor greenhouse gas emissions? So this is one of the areas that the department has advanced significantly. Again, I will talk to that. And then in the top middle is what we call sectoral emission targets. So these are the targets that we determine for allocation to sector departments. So that's the difference between them and industry limits. So as we speak now, we are working on getting those out for public comment. And then in the middle, bottom of the middle blocks is the industry emission limits. So this is what we're referring to carbon budgets. So these are the limits we give to industry. So there's a question, I think some of the points you raised, how do we identify who needs to be allocated that and what categories of emissions must be focused and which industry sector. So that's what this is about. And then in terms of your top right is industry implementation. So this is where we talk about mitigation plans. So currently we actually have regulations to manage this, but they are anchored under the Air Quality Act. So they are not called mitigation plans. They are rather called pollution prevention plans because of they align with the Air Pollution Act. So, but once the climate bill is passed into law, we will transfer those regulations to the new Climate Change Act, and therefore we'll call this mitigation plan. But this is where industry tells us what actions are they put in place to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Up to this point, there is a disconnect between the mitigation plans and the what we call carbon budgets. So one of the things we want to address is to integrate the two, such that the mitigation plans helps companies to meet their carbon budget. So that's one of the most important principles we're trying to address. And then in terms of the bottom right is what we call sector policies to drive mitigation. So, and this links largely to sectoral emission targets. So these are the policies and measures. The most common one that everyone knows and understands is the integrated resource plan for electricity. If that is not implemented, that has serious implications for us meeting our NDC target. So we follow those closely and we use them to quantify what targets we can assign to sector departments. This is just what the bill says. I'm sure most of you have seen the bill, so my intention is just not to go through that, but just to talk to some of the most important points. So in terms of the National Greenhouse Gas Emission Strategy, that is simply what we call the mitigation goal. So what targets are we putting in place up to 2050? As I've said, we don't have an up-to-date target. So the bill does says as soon as the bill is passed into law, the minister must initiate a process to get those developed and set forth a process, NEMA, because this bill is a SEMA, so it's a sectoral emission. It's a sectoral environmental act. So the broader principles of NEMA still applies to it. So in terms of consultation and other aspects, whatever we do here must follow NEMA principles, including enforcement, compliance, and so on. But there's just one exception in terms of carbon budgets, in terms of non-compliance, but we'll get to that. It does say, the bill does say, in the absence of a updated long-term goal, the NDC targets are the long-term goal for now. That's what it does say. It also calls for the minister to determine sectoral emission targets, working closely with sector departments. And it does say that sector departments must develop policies and measures that will help that sector to meet their sectoral emission targets first, but also help the country to meet our nationally determined contribution targets. And then obviously the minister must track and analyze the impact of implementation of policies and measures. So one begins to see that actually up to now, we have not had, as government, a coordinated process that mainstreams climate change. So this process here, as proposed by the bill, helps us to do that. So it does not only have benefits for climate change, it does ensure that whatever policies and measures that sector departments have put in place are implemented. And that has implications, for example, for sectors like transport, where things like road to rail, and so on must be implemented because it has other socioeconomic benefits as well. So government can actually use this as an instrument to enforce implementation of broader societal policies. The bill does ask for a listing of greenhouse gases and activities. So that's quite a straightforward activity where the minister must define what greenhouse gas needs to be managed. That is informed by a whole host of things, science, but also if, for example, we have sectors where we have problematic greenhouse gases that needs to be managed. I'm not sure if you're aware, but the IPCC is actually working on a new, special report on short-lived climate forces, like black carbon and so on, which should be finalized in 2027. So once that is developed, probably we'll have to review this list to include such pollutants, because most of them are pollutants. And then obviously the minister must gazette these, including the activities. In terms of carbon budgets, the minister must allocate carbon budgets to listed activities. Later on, I will talk about how we identify these listed activities, but those are largely industry emitting sectors. And if the idea here is that if you are allocated a carbon budget, you must also be assigned a greenhouse gas mitigation plan, because the mitigation plan must enforce the implementation of the carbon budget. Obviously, once this is done, the pollution prevention plans will cease to exist. We'll have a new integrated regulations. So the carbon budgets will be allocated over a 5-year commitment period. So that commitment period, companies have to report progress on. So the allocation happens before that a 5-year period. And then at the end of that 5-year period, there is a reconciliation and assessment of performance. However, since we are linking the carbon budgets to the carbon tax, I think for the revenue service purposes, they would want also annual assessment of performance, because in terms of taxation, that's how the tax works. So we will develop a system that accommodates for annual and end of period commitment period assessment. So this is the intention of this system. Treasury is particularly worried about end of commitment period assessment, because the tax liability is quite significant and companies might struggle for that. So if you annualize it, you're sort of spreading the risk, if you like. And then the bill also talks about management of what we call F gases or hydrofluorocarbons. And this is dealt with through our waste department, because they have a phase down and phase out of synthetic greenhouse gases. So this is a process that's well managed. I understand that our waste guys are actually having regulations around, phase down of F gases. So the bill is just making reference to that process here. And then in terms of the national greenhouse gas inventory, since we have now, clear targets, mid-term targets in terms of the NDC, but also in terms of pretty soon on the long-term mitigation goals, we have to track our emissions almost on an annual basis. So we have to set up a system that will enable us to generate inventories on an annual basis. But what is important to note about that is they will always be, let's say, 2 years behind. So if you compile an inventory this year, probably this is 2024, the latest will be 2022. You're always 2 years behind. That is similar to developed countries as well, because some data needs to be processed, cleaned before you compile an inventory. So I just thought I should then look at each of these and just give you a sense of what is happening, where we are, and what we are aiming for. So all the blocks that you see highlighted in black, that's what we're going to focus on now in terms of sectoral emission targets and sector policies to drive that. So where are we? If you go online to the government website, you will find the sets allocation framework document. This is a document that explains a couple of things. How are we going to allocate these sectoral emission targets to sector departments? What is the criteria that we'll follow? And also the steps to getting there. So that document was approved by Cabinet in 2021. And then since then, we've been engaging extensively with all these sector departments to engage with them and see, firstly, what policies and measures they can use to determine these targets. Some of these policies, some of these targets are not necessarily quantitative, they're qualitative, because we want to transform a particular sector. For example, in terms of human settlements, so we want to encourage them to develop building standards for energy efficient buildings and climate sensitive buildings, especially new buildings that whether they are commercial or residential. So those are some of the example of qualitative targets. The sectors that we are focusing on now is the transport, energy, agriculture, human settlements, water and sanitation, especially the sanitation aspect, as well as industry, including ourselves as environment. We probably contribute about 40% of the targets that have been set, especially when you combine carbon budgets as well. We have actually, since last month, we have developed through modeling what this target should be. Unfortunately, I couldn't add a slide here with the numbers because we're waiting for Minister to approve for publication, for public comment. But I will just give you an indication of the policies and measures that we are looking at. Our intention is to publish them for implementation in the next financial year, which is actually the 25-26 financial year. So what you see on your left is the sectors or the departments, and then what you see on the right are the kind of policies and measures that we have used to determine either quantitative or qualitative targets. So what we do is we use their objectives and targets to quantify emission savings. So if you look at IRP, it talks about the decommissioning rates of power stations. So we can use that to quantify what the emission should be. Also, the National Energy Efficiency Strategy, it has objectives and targets by sector. So we can use those to estimate what are the emissions implications. So that's essentially how we determine those targets. And as I said, for some of them, they are meant to transform or support implementation in various sectors towards greening the sector or transforming it, to a more climate sensitive sector. And that's very common for example, the Trade and Industry Department, where they have to set up a whole host of policies to help support industry to transition towards green industrialization. So that's just the portfolio. As I said, I can't show you, the model because of waiting for minister to approve. But this one we can show because, as you know, the IRP was published for public comments. So they asked us to also give them a carbon constraint that we think will be necessary to help us meet as a country to meet the NDC targets by 2030. So if you look at 2022, we've just done an inventory update, which will also be published for public comment. In 2022, ESCOM's emissions were sitting at 197 million tons. That is lower than their normal average because they average around 210 to 220 million tons. So obviously load shedding has had a big implication of that. For us to meet, our view is that for us to meet our NDC targets, we need the emissions to be around 125 million tons by 2030. Then if we consider other things in other sectors, we have what we call the SETS 1.5 degree scenario. So if they were to go to 190 million tons, combined with other things in other sectors, that will help us to be in the lower end of that range of our targets, because our targets, as you would know, are expressed as a range. So our emissions in 2030 must be between 350 million tons and 420 million tons. So what is also clear from our modeling exercise is that the economy is really not doing well. And we can see this also in our reporting program because we have a lot of companies that are deregistering, not for transfer of the carbon emitting assets, but for final closure. We just last week, we had a big company, I think it was the biggest company that produces ceramics, NGK Ceramics, Japanese company. It is closing, essentially, it is in the process. So there's a lot of closure of industries that is affecting the emissions profile of the country. So there's a couple of factors that are contributing to that as well. Okay, so in terms of the mitigation goal and our monitoring of emissions, I think I've sort of given an overview of our mitigation goal setting process. We do have what we call an updated nationally determined contribution, which gives targets up to 2030. We are due for an update because this target must be updated every 5 years. So we are due for an update. So this means that by end of next year, we must communicate new set of targets and we must not show regression. So probably right now, the upper range of those targets is around 420 million tons. That is compatible to a 2-degree global average temperature. The 350 million tons is compatible to 1.5 degrees. So as we know, especially after the IPCC report, the special report on 1.5, there's a need, an urgent need for countries to move towards 1.5 degrees. So, but we've said our target range is subject also to conditionality, because if we were to go to 1.5 degrees on our own, that will severely hurt our economy. So we need a series of investments towards green industrialization for us to get to 1.5 degrees. So those are some of the challenges that we face. We are also due for a review of our low emissions development strategy, which will help us explain how we get to net zero by 2050. There is a project, I'm hoping that Julia has shared the guidance note that we were asking for a wide range of societal role players to tell us what kind of a society they see in 2050, considering, a net zero society and economy, but from a good life point of view, because it's no use for us to just do modeling to say, using a least cost, technology-centric approach, this is how we get to 2050, knowing that we have a serious problem of inequality, poverty, and unemployment. So those three things must be at the center. In fact, they should be the departure point, for us to determine this target. So that's what we are doing with this work now in terms of a 2050 net zero target. So I'm hoping that you probably are contributing to that, because I think we have to submit before the end of the month. So yeah, and I think Julia had committed to support in terms of the drafting process. So that would be great if you could help us there as the academia. In terms of monitoring of greenhouse gases, this is an area that we've advanced quite a lot as a department. Since 2017, we developed a mandatory reporting program. So industry reports their emissions to us on an annual basis. The reporting cycle starts in January, ends at the end of March. They report for the previous year. So currently, companies are preparing their reports for last year. And that information helps us to compile the inventory, but also to track our targets. Emissions from this program, because South Africa's emissions profile is skewed towards industry emissions. So about 70 to 80% of our emissions are actually from industry. The balance just, is largely from transport and waste. The rest is not that significant. So, we capture roughly, as I said, 70 to about 80% of our total emissions using this system. Yeah. So this is just to show you where we are in terms of our emissions. We have the presentation, so you might not be able to see the slides properly, but you will have the presentation. So in 2022, if we consider the net emissions accounting for land use, because land use acts as the sink of greenhouse gases, our emissions were around 435 million tons. That's very close to the upper range of our 2030 target, which is 420 million tons. So we're almost there, but with an understanding that, we are in recovery mode after COVID. Our economy, as you know, is not growing that much. State SA communicated growth in economy, but it was really marginal. So that just shows that there's stagnation in the economy at the moment. But the biggest source of our emissions, as I said, is the energy sector. A bit from agriculture, that's largely livestock, and then waste also contributes, and obviously process emissions from industry as well. And the biggest two sources of our emissions, the first three, is Eskom and SASO. Those two combined contribute between 50 to 55%, depending, the scale of operation. So if you solve those two, then you will probably deal with half of our emissions. If you also deal with road transportation, that's what this is showing, you will be, helping a lot, especially in my view, freight. If you can transfer freight to rail, that will help a lot, because public transport is very a complex aspect to address in the short term. But I think rail with some investments will really help a lot. And then these are some of the indicators that are linked to greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a lot of argument that is made to say COVID has worsened the situation in terms of emissions. But what these indicators show here, especially the sort of pale blue, trend on top there, it shows the dissociation of emissions from the economy. There are two reasons for that. One of them I've already explained, which is we are seeing a lot of decommissioning of some of the big carbon emitting assets. One of the things that has happened in the past 12 years is, especially in iron and steel, because iron and steel used to be a big source of emissions. So what we've seen is there's a lot of conversion from primary steel production to electric arc furnaces. So that reduced emissions a lot. We had some of our ferroalloys plant that were decommissioned because they were not competitive anymore. And then some, as I mentioned, some of the closure of companies. So that contributes to that also, but also the economic aspects, including the shift towards the services-oriented economy. So that's what is driving the dissociation of emissions from economic activity. And then the orange line is just showing greenhouse gas emissions per capita. This has sort of declined in a very stagnated way. You can see that between 2019 and 2023, relative to the 2000 levels, there's only about a decrease of about 8% between, pre-COVID and after COVID period. And then if we look at the dark blue line at the bottom, this is emissions per unit of energy consumed by the economy. And you can see that there has been stagnation because our energy production profile has not changed much, especially in the past four years. In fact, there has been stagnation in the use of energy in that period. So that's why you see almost between 2019 and 2020, not a significant change in terms of that indicator. So when people say the cause of reduction in emission is because of COVID, I think this clearly shows that this trend has been declining even before COVID. So that's the key message from the.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Sorry. Shouldn't we see a kind of decline in that last bottom line because of the increase in renewable energy generation?
Yeah, but the thing is, our emissions are not evenly distributed, and you have a big carbon emitting assets. So those assets are still there. They sort of cloud or whatever renewable energy assets. So it's not a one-to-one replacement. Yeah. Okay, so in terms of industry implementation, this is what we call the mitigation plans. So in other words, these are the things that industry stipulate they will do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Currently, we are in the second commitment period of this. The first commitment period was between 2016 and 2020. And now we are in the second commitment period between 2021 and 25. So we have already analyzed it's just that I did not put the numbers here, but we've analyzed the impact of the first commitment period. And in there, we saved around 40 million tons through a number of interventions. For example, from implementation of interventions in nitric acid production, in the cement sector, in terms of shifting towards alternative fuels, and a whole host of interventions. Some of them are scope 2 related to electricity, basically. So we're looking forward to the next one. But the problem has been that there's been a disconnect between this and the carbon budget. So the regulations that we're developing now are actually aiming at addressing that. Okay, so there are lessons that we've learned from the previous commitment period, which ended in 2020. Those regulations, if you look at them, they don't say much. They don't clarify exactly what information needs to be collected to track and monitor implementation of pollution prevention plans. They don't specify methods to be followed when one is assessing the effectiveness of mitigation actions. And also, they do not ask for assumptions when companies are reporting on
the amount of emission reductions that they will achieve. So those are some of the problems that we faced. So there was a lot of inaccuracy but also large uncertainty associated with the numbers companies reported. So we want to correct that in this new set of regulations. And we clearly see this from the annual progress report that companies have reported. Yeah. And also we sometimes see disconnect between what industry reports through the mitigation plans and in terms of our online reporting system called SAGES, the South African Greenhouse Gas Emission Reporting System. So you find that they account for facilities that they are actually not reporting for. Because one of the problems we have now between these three instruments, that is the reporting program, the carbon budgets, and the mitigation plan, we don't, in terms of defining who needs to report for this, we don't have a single determinant, like, for example, using operational control. So that's one of the things we'll be correcting in the regulations. Okay, in terms of industry emission limits, we also have a framework that was approved by government in 2021, by cabinet in 2021. It's also available on the .gov website. It also outlines the methods that will be followed to allocate carbon budgets. It also specifies how we will determine the sectors that will be subject to that and other technical aspects as well. So once that was passed into law, we started a process of data collection to industry. We thought we could not wait for the bill to be passed into law, because if we do that, we'll lose considerable amount of time. So, but luckily industry have been cooperating. So we've asked for them to provide information. About 50% of companies have provided information. The balance will provide that before the end of this year. And then we have started in some cases with the allocation process. Even though we don't have regulations, we don't have a bill passed into law, with an understanding that once that is done, those carbon budgets will be reviewed where appropriate. The other thing that we've been doing, we've been running a series of workshops with stakeholders. We just ran one, the last one was in February actually, where we asked people to present what their thoughts are and what we should consider in this regulation. So those workshops have been very valuable, and they've been tense as well, because you have NGOs, industry, academia sitting in one room, and so there's bound to be tension. So, but our view is that we should embrace that and look for a way forward. So that's what we've been doing. So we actually have draft regulations now. They are informed largely by these engagements. Obviously, we cannot publish them for public comment until the bill is passed into law. You're probably aware now that the bill is being subject to provincial engagements. But I understand that, government is aiming to publish them for implementation before the end of this administration. So you're looking at next month or early May, hopefully that it can be passed into law. So that's the idea, really. Okay, in terms of scope, one of the problems we want to solve is we want to make sure that we are dealing with the same person that is allocated a carbon budget, that has got a mitigation plan and is reporting to our reporting program, so that there is traceability across these three instruments. So the approach we have adopted is the definition of what a data provider is in terms of the emissions reporting regulations should be maintained for carbon budgets as well as mitigation plans. And then companies must, and that is based on operational control. So companies must declare operational control. The other problem with carbon budgets is because they are voluntary, some companies report them at company level and not informed by the facility level data. So, there's no top-down traceability there. So if we achieve this, that implies we'll be able to track the carbon budget at company level, but also at a facility level as well. So that's an important principle here to consider. The other problem is that in some cases, a carbon tax-paying entity is not the same as the emissions reporting entity in terms of our program. And that can never be aligned because, that's financial legislation that Treasury is using, and we are using NEMA. So we must always maintain the principle of operational control. But if emissions are reported at facility level, there should be traceability. So if you have an entity that says we have financial control over this entity, and these are our facilities that are subject to carbon tax, let's say 2 out of 3, then we can trace that easily and say, okay, based on that, that's your tax liability and your carbon budget. And then obviously they have to say the other facility belongs to another data provider that has operational control over it. So with this system, there will be traceability, even if there's not one-to-one relationship in terms of a tax-paying entity and a data provider in terms of our legislation. So that's one of the things we have to track. This, I think, to your question about what sources of emissions will form part and parcel of the carbon budget. This is what we have presented in the workshops that we have presented, and we have not had a different view. But we have what we call mandatory sources of emissions and voluntary sources of emissions. The mandatory sources of emissions are those that are related to Scope 1 or direct emissions: stationary combustion, civil aviation, domestic, fugitive, and industrial process emissions. Those are mandatory. They form part and parcel of the carbon budget allocation net. So there's no flexibility in terms of electing these activities. They are always in, irrespective of which commitment period we are in. So that's what these last 2 columns are trying to say. For the first commitment period, those are in. For subsequent commitment periods, they will be in, and they will be part of carbon budget accounting. We also have some of Scope 1 emissions that are not mandatory, but voluntary. For example, road transportation, because we cannot allocate in an equitable way carbon budgets based on road transportation, because we have individuals, we have companies, and so that's not a straightforward thing to do. So that's there's a flexibility there. If you elect it, that's fine. But once you elect it, it will remain across all the commitment periods. So if you elect it in the first commitment period, our intention is that the first commitment period is between 2026 and 2030, because that's compatible with the NDC timeline. So once you elect that activity, it's in even in the next or subsequent commitment period. That is road transportation, agriculture, forestry, and waste. Our reporting program accommodates for some of those activities as well. And then Scope 2 emissions, that's largely electricity and heat sourced from outside your operations. That is voluntary. If you elect it, it does not form part and parcel of your carbon budget accounting, because we have not figured out yet how to appraise Scope 2 emissions as part of the carbon budget allocation process. So we are just using this for data collection more than anything else, because maybe they can be accommodated under the carbon tax. So if you show that you have decreased your emissions intensity of Scope 2 emissions, maybe Treasury can give you an allowance. So Treasury is currently thinking about whether to do that or not. So if it happens, it will be an incentive for companies to elect that activity. So it's voluntary in the first commitment period. It remains voluntary also in the next commitment period. So if you decided in the first commitment period, you want to account for Scope 2 emissions, and then when that ends, we get into the second one, you say, I don't want to account for this anymore. You're more than happy to do that. This also includes Scope 3 emissions as well. Yeah. Okay, so in terms of thresholds, this is the question around how we determine who needs to be allocated at carbon budget. So luckily for us, for the past 6 years, we've been running a reporting program. So we have a very comprehensive database of information from industry, at least the companies that are reporting to us. And our assessment is that 30,000 tons is a reasonable threshold. So anyone who emits above 30,000 tons must be allocated a carbon budget. If we account the emissions cumulative, we don't see any significant changes to the total emissions if we consider emissions below that threshold. There is about 75 companies that meet that reporting threshold, and they own about, say, maybe 200 and something facilities, give or take. So that's what we're using at the moment. This threshold will change from time to time because what is happening is the profile of companies reporting changes as well. As I mentioned, some companies are decommissioning. So that affects, the assessment of this threshold, basically. So if we look at that threshold, these are the companies or the sectors that fall above the threshold. Most of them you're familiar with. There is some food and beverage companies, but the problem with that sector, especially if you're using something like a benchmark, you don't know what the true coverage is. So there's a problem with that. But also, if you look at the total emissions from food and beverages, it's not that much. So there are very few companies that exceed that threshold. So that's one of the sectors which, even though some companies go above that threshold, we're asking ourselves whether we should, consider them or not for allocation, because there's some equity issues associated with that and coverage issues associated with that. But most of these are quite, relevant in this case. Okay, so in terms of the methods that we'll be using to allocate carbon budgets, there's 3 methods that we've decided to adopt. When we started this process, there was a big pressure for us to consider benchmarking only. But the problem with product benchmarking is, in the South African case, for example, you find companies that are unique. I guess it's because of where South Africa is. So, for example, some ferroalloys plant are integrated with iron and steel. So how do you then allocate a product benchmark in that case? And then also Treasury did a benchmarking for one of the allowances on performance. And it was really difficult to allocate for that. But there are sectors that are quite straightforward to allocate a benchmark, like the cement sector, because they don't have a wide range of products, well-defined products that are traceable. So their benchmarking works very well. So we have done a study to assess which sectors we can allocate a benchmark, which sectors we can't be able to do that. So benchmarking, as I said, is one. Then there's the target approach, which is largely linked to grandfathering. But this is where you allocate, a single target across the board, irrespective of the scale of emissions, but also the sectors that contributes the most. So one is oblivious to that. You just apply a blanket target across the board. We have been doing this with the voluntary carbon budget. It has some advantages in terms of application of the method, but it has some disadvantages as well, because we always find that the true performance is always way outside what the target was set. So that's one of the challenges. But in some cases, it's actually the only way to use, like in the case of Sasol, because of the complexity, numerous products that they produce, and there are no benchmarks for Sasol as well globally. So there's nothing to compare against. So we are forced to use a variant of this target approach. So that's another one. And then we also have the mitigation potential approach. So this is where we do a mitigation potential analysis by sector. So we sit with the sector, identify measures that can be implemented based on our knowledge of what technologies exist, what other interventions can be implemented, and what amount of emission savings we'll get from that. And then that then gets used to allocate a carbon budget, a carbon budget basically. So, but in terms of our preferred approach, we believe that benchmarking should be considered top priority. If it cannot be applied, then we must investigate the mitigation potential analysis approach. This one is in fact more relevant because if you look at section 24C of the bill, it asks that we must consider the most feasible technologies when we allocate carbon budgets and things like that. So that's compatible with the idea of applying a mitigation potential analysis, because by the time we allocate carbon budget, we must be informed what measures can be applied and available for various sectors as well. And then the least preferred approach is this target or approach, if you like. Okay, I think I did touch on where we are with the carbon budget. So, we are currently collecting data for the phase 2. We have about 50% of this data, so we're ready to allocate for those. We do have draft regulations, which we will refine, and hopefully if the bill gets passed into law before the end of this administration, maybe early on in the next administration around, say, August, September, we'll be able to publish them for public comment. And that's it, yes, thank you.
Judith, perhaps you should share since you're more familiar, so you can deal with the Q&A unless you have some questions you want to ask.
I have some questions and I'll use my thank you so much, Jongi. Yeah, really kind of so much depth and work is going into this process, and it's really useful to have someone kind of come and explain every single step. So we really appreciate that, and we really appreciate your time.
Yeah.
I just want to, sorry, if I can just have a look here. I think there's a question in the Q&A. So stop sharing. Yeah, in the meantime, in the room, okay, I've got a question from Mbuso. Anyone else? And Robert. Okay, and everyone. Okay, great. So let's start with the questions in the room, and then we'll take some questions in the Q&A. People online, please feel free to add your questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to them. Okay, over to Mbuso first.
Thanks, Jongikhaya, for the presentation of being here. My first question is, what is a carbon budget? Because we've been talking about carbon budget allocation and we're not clear about how does it work and to who does it apply. The second question, I've actually talked about monitoring, carbon emissions by different sectors of the industry in the country. And of course, this expectation does have implications in respect of the adoption of, job shedding technologies, and also the expectation that companies must decommission huge carbon emitting technologies or production systems. My question is there an expectation by the industries that are big committers or emitters, as it were, to also account for the job shedding, expectations that could accompany their mitigation strategies? Because I think that should actually form part of the monitoring process. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So, do you want to take one question at a time, or should we take a couple and then you respond?
Maybe we can take all of them.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Maybe we can address the ones that are clear, and then we can allow online.
Okay, sure. Okay, Robert, do you want to go next?
I don't know that you're building on the previous question, sense of concern about mass job losses. And I don't think just for direct for employees of implicated high emitting industries, but also the knock-on effects in regions. Like we just see areas where there are a lot of mine closures already, prior to long before even the trouble budget. But my question is, just on that context and the huge ramifications, I'd like to hear a bit more about the reference to the earlier of the stakeholder engagement in the process of developing the current system, actually developing the regulations to come around drafted. So I'd like to get a sense of some of the different kinds of stakeholders, whether there was also, in addition to industry and departments, whether there was a significant and a kind of diverse range of organized labor, particularly in those areas, but also independent civics, including, for example, mining affected community organizations, and all of that, but just a sense of that, and also kind of how it's advertised, and like, were there lots of meetings? And then my related question is, when the actual, in the best case scenario, August, September, they'll publish the comments, will there be a lot of local kind of in-person roadshows where the broader stakeholders can engage, or just webinars? Because we have seen attending, not in this department, other departments, towards only webinars, which excludes a lot of people. Thanks. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Imran?
So, firstly, fantastic that you're doing this work. I think it's really kind of amazing that the department's putting these systems in place. I have a few questions that I think would link to the economics of this. So, do you see these budgets as tradable? So let's say kind of Eskom gets its budget that it doesn't use fully. Can it sell that? And how would this link up with kind of offset? So if you go above, can you offset, etc. So that kind of tradability issue. Then I sort of guess a question linked to the two that have been asked. What's clear from the data is that the emissions have come down or haven't grown because the economy hasn't grown. Should our budgets not be determined by some projections on we want the economy to grow by 5%, we want employment to grow? If we build that into the way you modeled it out, that then might impose kind of higher restrictions on those who are doing the kind of emitting at present. So is there any thinking on that framework of trying to do this with a plan that actually grows the economy?
Yeah, thank you so much for the questions, and really appreciate them, because I think they show the many facets of this process. It's not just about the allocation of this study, but there are socioeconomic implications. And this is what we've been saying, even with the sectoral emission targets. So yeah, in terms of the first question, yeah, what is the carbon budget? Well, in terms of the bill, we define it as an assigned amount of allocation of emissions to a particular industry sector, and then by implication to a specific company within that sector. Because here there's a need to balance the top down and the bottom up. So you have the company bottom up meeting, but you have a national target that this company must contribute in terms of their emission reduction efforts. So, from the emission, from the target, you are able to come up with an industry-wide constraint, and then that constraint you distribute across the sectors depending on their level. So that's what it is. In terms of identifying who needs to be allocated this, we are in an opportune position because we have a reporting system, as I've said, which started in 2017. So we have about 6 years worth of information. So we use that to determine what is the reasonable threshold that we can use to determine what we consider significant emitters. If you look at the pollution prevention plans now, there is a threshold. That threshold was not based on informed information at all, but it's coming from the National Climate Change Response Policy. It's about 0.1 million tons or 100,000 tons of emissions. And we can clearly see that it's missing a lot of carbon. So that's how we determine them. And then obviously, we also know what emission sources that must be accounted for in that case. So I hope that clarifies what a carbon budget is in that sense. I think your second point and question is very valid in terms of job sharing. I think this is actually what the just transition is about. It's an understanding how, when we implement climate change response, not only jobs, but also livelihoods, how they'll be affected by this, greening or transformation of those sectors towards low carbon sectors, if you like. So the one thing that we did in 2018 as a department, we did what we call the National Employment Vulnerability Assessment to understand what will be the job and livelihood implications. That is now, I think, publicly available. The way we looked at it from a value chain perspective. So there's about 5 value chains that we looked at that we assess will be severely impacted by this transition. It's the coal value chain, and then you have the industry value chain. That's largely dealing with process emissions and hard to abate sectors like iron and steel and cement. Then you have tourism, which links also to aviation as well. Then you have agriculture. Agriculture has highly pronounced implications in terms of adaptation as well. And then there's transport, petroleum-based transport as well. So we quantified how many jobs will be lost and the livelihoods that will be affected, and where possible, localize those impacts, like in the case of coal, Mpumalanga is obviously. But what was not done is an understanding of the implications in other provinces, because a lot of the people working there are coming from Limpopo, KZN, Eastern Cape. So, they are supporting secondary or informal economies there. So, I think that needs to be understood further. And then once we did that, we did some study in terms of sector job resilience plans to understand what interventions can be implemented. Obviously, that's tied to support and also response by government. So one of the biggest response measures now has been, as you know, that JET-IP, Just Energy Transition Implementation or Investment Plan. Later last year, they developed an implementation plan for it. But it's targeting at the moment electricity, both in terms of renewable energies and grid expansion. It's focusing on electric vehicles and as well as green hydrogen. So there's still a gap in terms of these other value chains. So that needs to be done. And then to your point about monitoring, yes. So we are now, that employment vulnerability assessment is due for an update. So we're planning to start an update pretty soon. But what we realized, because at the time when we were doing it at the beginning, there was no implementation of Just Transition. Now there is. So not only do we need to update it, but we also need to make it dynamic. So if someone is implementing something somewhere, then they need to log information into a system that keeps tracks. Okay, these are the jobs created, these are the jobs lost. These are the interventions that were implemented at cost XYZ, stuff like that we want to work between now and next year. So yeah, so that talks to that aspect. Yeah, in terms of engagements, so if one looks at the bill, so that was engaged on extensively through all this process ourselves first, where we go to communities, but also through the portfolio committee. They were in all, I think we visited at least 3 districts in each province. The provinces now are doing the same thing. And then there were, presentations from various constituencies. I'm not sure if Wits did, but a whole host of the portfolio committee arranged sessions where various constituencies gave presentations on that. But specifically in terms of the regulations, Normally, the process is we develop regulations, then we publish them for public comment, and then we engage society. But we thought we must, given the nature and sensitivity of this, we must do this engagement even before. So these are actually informal technical engagements. So we invite specific people and organizations that we think will provide meaningful input in informing the development of the regs. Some of them are coming from NGOs. So, our understanding is that they're reflecting what, people on the ground are thinking about the regs and so on. Unfortunately, we invited labor in a number of meetings. They have not pitched up, but we'll probably organize a session with them specifically. And then we've had inputs from academia. Also, during the process of public commenting on the bill to Portfolio Committee, we received a lot of technical comments on the carbon budgets. That really helped us in this process of developing the rate. So I hope that answers that question. If I've missed something, please do let me know. And then in terms of, yes, that this has been discussed a lot in terms of trading. Even when the carbon tax was being developed, Treasury, okay, first of all, trading or tax is within the realm of Treasury. So they have to make a decision on what's the best approach. So their view when they were developing the position paper on the tax, explaining why the tax and not trading, their view was that our emissions are not evenly distributed. So you have maybe 5 or 6 companies that account for, that account for about, say, 65 to 70% of emissions. That's Eskom, Sasol, ArcelorMittal, Glencore. I think there's one ferroalloy industry. So there's no spread. So they felt that the trading system wouldn't work well. But that pressure is not stopped. Even now, Treasury announced, as you know, their proposed reforms to the carbon tax in the budget law speech. I think they still receive comments on a switch towards trading. My understanding is at the moment they are not in favor of trading for the same reasons. But if we were to go to trading, then the monitoring regime will have to change, because right now we're using an activity-based trading. So you will tell us how much fuel you've burned on. But with trading, we have to actually do direct measurements of your emissions. Because with trading, you have to be accounting for the absolute units as well. So there's that aspect as well. But the carbon tax regime does have an offset scheme, which limits eligibility to about 10% of your total emissions. So they are considering whether not to increase that or not to compensate for this need for trading. It will be interesting to see whether they will accommodate that or not. And then on the second question, yes, we've just completed, as I mentioned, the modeling of sectoral emission targets that we allocate to departments, including ourselves. So in that assessment, we included the impact of a combined tax and carbon budget. And we determined that for that, it will contribute to about 50 million tons of emission. So through this carbon budget process, that's what we are aiming for. This 50 million tons take into account projected GDP growth, calibrated with what SARS, the Reserve Bank, has communicated, including states in terms of projections. So we are, in fact, taking that into account in the allocation process, give or take. Yeah, so I think I've answered. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So we do have a few questions from some people online. I wanted to check if they would like to ask the question live or if we should just read them. So if you would like to ask your question live, Irvi Gledhill, you can raise your hand. Okay, great. I'll allow you to speak and then go ahead.
Hello. Thank you very much for a super interesting and informative session. I wanted to ask about any comments you might have on the potential impact of the Musina Mukado Special Economic Zone, because it has both an enormous impact on jobs and an enormous impact on the environment, with about 9 or 10 different plants, including coking, ferrochrome, ferromanganese, manganese, lime plants, stainless steel, high vanadium steel, high manganese steel, and so on. And it has impact on the UNESCO World Heritage Sites and wetland sites. So I just wanted to ask about any comment you might have on that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Irvin. Rudolph, would you like to ask your questions live? Great. I'll allow you to. Oh, can you just raise your hand again, please, Rudolph? Great. Okay, you should be able to talk.
I can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much for this very, very good and insightful presentation. I was just wondering, I had 2 questions, but I think my second question has been answered around carbon credit trading. The financial industry basically sits in the middle of the economy, and it facilitates capital flows throughout the economy, and therefore is in an ideal position to help to drive the transition to a low carbon economy. And I was just wondering what you think some of the key contributions are that you would expect from the financial industry in that regard. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Rudolph. Would anyone else like to ask a question live? You can raise your hand. Okay, great. We'll just take those for now.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think in terms of the question from Ivy, I don't have the intimate details of the planned, interventions there, but obviously, there's a wide range of environmental impacts from it. But if you look at some of the industries that you've mentioned, most of them will probably have marginal emissions implications in terms of greenhouse gases. It might be significant in terms of air pollutants. But, for example, coking for sure will have significant emissions, even though there we largely look at methane emissions. So the scale of it, that will depend on the scale of the coking. As I said, I'll have to see what those will be. In terms of other ferroalloys-based processes like ferromanganese, vanadium, and so on, the research work shows that there's very little emissions per ton of product for those processes. Hence, if you look at the IPCC guidance, there's no particular guidance for those. Even in the 2019 refinement of that guidance, there's still no methodological guidance on those processes. But it may well be, that in some areas like coking, there would be significant emissions. Probably also in terms of wetlands, the disturbance of wetlands. But I'll have to see the documentation on that in terms of detail. In terms of the role for the financial industry, well, there's a couple of roles that could be played there. The one for sure is, informing how industry, shift towards green industrialization. So, financing has to take that into consideration. Globally now, there's a lot of guidance around that. Many jurisdictions have put in place clear guidelines around financing different types of activities. I think it's for the South African financial sector to do the same. I know through the Banking Association of South Africa, they've worked closely with UNEP to try and domesticate some of that guidance. So I think there is work in progress that the sector is doing in that regard. And then the other one is financing, especially we have carbon budgets and the mitigation plans. And the argument we're putting forward with our legislation is that the mitigation plans should help to enforce the implementation of carbon budgets. But quite often industries sometimes struggle with resources to implement or financing to implement. So I think this is where maybe the financing sector, working closely with Treasury, can look into that and see how industry can be supported with implementation, of some of the mitigation measures as well. Then in terms of the just transition, I don't see a lot of role playing by the finance sector in the just transition. But in terms of, and it's a rather strange one, because in terms of a policy response, there are very clear policy signals, because quite often the argument is that government is not putting in place clear policy response. But this is one area actually where there's very clear policy response. It's clear what the intervention should be. This is at least for the energy transition. It's also clear what the resource requirements are, and the timelines for implementation. But I'm not seeing the financial sector, playing a role, or at least asking the question there what role they can play. So maybe that's another area I would argue that maybe one can look at. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Jongi. I wanted to check if there are any more questions in the room. I might jump in with mine. So I wanted to ask just kind of a first clarifying question, which is the carbon budgets, from what I understood from the bill, is that if someone exceeds their carbon budget, the repercussion is that they will have to pay a higher carbon tax rate. Is that correct? Do you mind just like fleshing that out again? And then I have a few other quick questions, which one is, so will Eskom have a carbon budget, and like how will that work? How does Eskom's budget work? And also, I guess, is Treasury thinking about a carbon budget for the whole economy? And is there not a potential to kind of link the carbon budget for the economy to also kind of our national budgets? And then the last one I had was just whether I guess if you have any kind of pointers, you've mentioned a few things on like research gaps and what you kind of need input on as the department. You mentioned, further investigation of job impacts around different provinces. Are there any other research gaps that, us as the academic community should be thinking about so that we can support this process? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julia. Yeah, I think on the first question you raised, your assessment is correct. If one exceeds, this is the current thinking. If one exceeds the carbon budgets, one pay a higher tax rate on the emissions above the budget. So if you were allocated 100 tons of emissions, then by the end of that 5-year commitment period, you emit 110. So it means on the 10 extra 10, you pay the higher tax rate, which Treasury had indicated could be around 640 rands per ton. But I think they will probably review that. I'm not sure what rate eventually they will communicate. So that's substantially more higher than the rate that they've communicated going up to 2030. So that is the idea, yes.
Can I ask a quick follow-up? Sorry.
Yeah.
So I guess the risk potentially is that then companies will just say, well, we're going to exceed the carbon budget. We'll just, we'll budget it into our tax, that we're going to just pay that extra bit because we, it's like if they've got enough money, they can allow for it. Shouldn't there be like a hard stop, like a cap where you can't actually go above that? And if you do your, operational, you shouldn't be allowed to operate.
Yeah, so if the tax rate is not sensitive enough to induce behavioral change, then what you're saying is true. But if it's not, then it will hurt companies. I think if you look at the trajectory that they communicated of the price rate, it's quite clear that will have a serious implication, even for the normal tax rate on emissions below the budget. And then the other thing we did was we did with Treasury an assessment of what are the cost implications for some of the companies, because we sort of know the emissions profile, what it will mean in terms of their tax liability, if they exceed the budget, and you can see that it will be quite significant. Yeah, so that's the one. Yeah, that's what I would say there. If we were to continue at the trajectory of the current tax rate, then yes, there wouldn't be any implications at all. That's why Treasury was under pressure to review the tax rate, and they've done that. Yeah. Will Eskom have a carbon budget? Yes. In fact, they do have now under the voluntary carbon budget scheme, so they will continue to have. But the question is maybe whether they'll pay or not, because in this current tax design, they're exempted from it to avoid the pass-through to the consumer. But what I'm hearing and understanding from Treasury is that will fall away, in the mandatory carbon budget phase. So that has serious implications, of course. Maybe that's another research gap to understand with or without pass-through. So Treasury might pass a rule to say, you will have to pay tax with pass-through. Then one has to assess what are the socioeconomic impacts of that, or without pass-through, what are the socioeconomic implications of that, and they're quite significant. Another research question of interest would be to look at the impact of maybe carbon budgets, because Eskom is the biggest source of emission, but in a decentralized system, because that's where we are moving now. We are liberalizing the electricity sector. So one has to understand, how will that look like, but what implication does that have on the economy, if you like. Also, the impact of the carbon tax on industry, it's another interesting one. Yeah, to research gap. But maybe not so much for the, okay, maybe before I go there, but also the other thing maybe to look at is in terms of the industry sectors, linking to the issue about just transition, to understand, what are the risks in terms of jobs and livelihoods for those, especially the hard to abate sectors. So that will be your cement, your iron and steel, your ferroalloys, the chemicals industry, the minerals industry, of course, I've mentioned cement, and the metals industry broadly. So I think it's an area of interest to us. But on the sectoral emission targets, I think the big thing is what we're trying to do. So using the triple challenge of unemployment, inequality, and poverty, because I think it fits well with your research agenda. How do we use those as a departure point for determining things like targets? So yeah, that is the issue. Then so I answered 4, and then in terms of 3, yes, this is the intention. So we have an economy-wide budget. Then we understand in that budget there are emissions that none of these instruments will deal with. For example, emissions from let's say poultry farming. Well, there's none of these will, because they're too small to be captured by a budget. Some policy instruments might not be effective to deal with them. So we need to first isolate those emission sources. Then whatever that's left of is then what that economy-wide target is. Then from there, we must assess what can be attributed to sectoral emission targets, like in the form of IRP, in the form of the green transport strategy, energy efficiency strategy, and so on. Then after having done that, we are left with a carbon budget, broader top-down allocation. Then that's what we cascade then to the various sectors. So we have actually done that about 2 weeks ago. So we have an understanding of what a carbon budget coupled with the tax will give us in terms of emission. Then we must just spread that now to the sectors.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, any last questions from anyone? Please raise your hands online if you'd like to ask any follow-ups or in the room. No? Okay, great. Then we can eat some breakfast. for those who are in the room, and I hope those online can go get a snack or a coffee. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining this morning. Thank you so much again to Jongi for the excellent presentation and really great kind of engagement on the questions. And everyone have a great week.